She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, heart beating just a little faster than usual. The chamber was filled with murmurs, tension, anticipation, a mixture of old tradition and modern urgency. But in her mind, none of that mattered. The cameras, the formality, the sea of suits, she barely noticed. What mattered to her was what she heard, not what she saw. And what she heard that night reached into a place she hadn't dared revisit in years. The words coming from the podium weren't flashy or laced with clever phrasing. They were clear, direct. And to her, they sounded like home. Not the place she lived now, but the place she came from. The small blue-collar town where the factories had once hummed and where neighbors leaned on one another not out of convenience but necessity. She could still smell the sawdust on her father's coat when he came home after 12-hour shifts. Still remember the creak of the floorboards in her grandparents' house where prayers were whispered before every meal, not out of routine but because they truly didn't know what tomorrow would bring. So when she heard someone finally acknowledge those people, her people, it broke something loose inside her. The stories being told weren't just generic anecdotes. They were her family's story, her neighbors. The single mother down the street who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. The veteran who returned from overseas only to battle loneliness and medical bills. The grandfather who never complained, even when his pension barely covered groceries. These weren't abstractions to her. They were names, faces, lives intertwined with her own. Each sentence struck with the force of memory. And not the romanticized. Kind, but the real gritty kind. The kind forged in late nights and early mornings, with calloused hands and empty gas tanks. She remembered watching her mother clip coupons at the kitchen table, carefully mapping out meals for the week. She remembered the town's only diner, how it used to be packed on Sunday mornings after church, and how, over the years, those booths grew emptier. People moved away. Dreams dimmed. Hope, once loud and unashamed, had become a whisper. As the words rang through the chamber, they seemed to stretch across time and distance. They didn't just reach her ears. They wrapped around every part of her that had ever felt unseen, unheard, overlooked. They breathed life into parts of her identity she had almost tucked away. There had been moments, especially after leaving for college, when she felt the world didn't understand people like her. When being from a small town, being raised with values like hard work, loyalty, and faith felt like something to apologize for, but not in that moment. In that moment, it all felt honored. Her eyes welled with tears, not out of weakness, but out of recognition. It was as though someone had finally walked into the story of her life and said, "I see you. I see them." She wasn't used to that. She had heard speeches before, eloquent, rehearsed, safe. But this wasn't like the others. It wasn't calculated for applause. It was real. It was raw. It was personal. She thought of her high school teachers who stayed late to help kids pass because failure wasn't an option, of the church volunteers who delivered groceries to shut-ins, of the factory workers who, even when their jobs were outsourced, still showed up to town hall meetings, still believed their voices mattered. For so long, she feared those stories would fade, buried beneath headlines and policy papers. But now they were being spoken aloud, broadcast across the country. Something shifted in her that night. She wasn't just witnessing history, she was feeling it. Not from a distance, but in her chest, in her bones. It was as though a page had turned in her life, and for the first time she saw herself, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who belonged. Her hometown, her values, her memories, they all had a place in this conversation, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. She didn't plan to cry. She'd told herself to be composed, to sit with dignity, to observe with the poise expected of someone in her position. But when the words started to flow, something deep within her gave way. It wasn't a dramatic breakdown. There was no sobbing, no theatrical moment for the cameras. It was quieter than that, more sacred. The kind of emotion that sneaks up on you, wells up slowly, and then spills over before you can stop it. A single tear at first, tracing a path down her cheek, followed by another and another, until she could no longer blink them away. They were tears born not of sorrow, but of memory. Because what was being spoken wasn't some distant policy or abstract narrative. It was about the people she had loved, the ones who shaped her, the ones no longer here to see this moment. Her thoughts turned instantly to her grandfather, a strong man with a soft voice, a war veteran who never boasted about the medals he kept tucked in a drawer, only ever mentioning the names of those who didn't come home. He was the kind of man who believed in duty, who stood during the national anthem even when age made it difficult, who saluted with a trembling hand because some traditions were worth holding on to. She remembered the way he used to sit on the porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, telling her stories not just about battlefields but about rebuilding, about what it meant to return home, to start over, to find purpose in peacetime. She thought of his funeral, the folded flag pressed into her grandmother's hands, the haunting sound of taps in the cold air. And now, in this moment, it was as if his story was finally being told, not just to her, not just to family, but to a nation. The mention of sacrifices, the kind made in silence, without glory, hit her like a wave. She'd seen it firsthand. Not just in her grandfather, but in countless others from her hometown who wore invisible scars. The factory workers who showed up even when the machines slowed down and the paychecks got thinner. The mothers who skipped meals so their kids wouldn't have to. The young men who enlisted because college wasn't an option, only to come back to a country that too often forgot them. These were the quiet heroes. Their names weren't written in marble or sung in anthems, but they had carried entire communities on their shoulders. And now, somehow, they were being acknowledged. Her tears weren't for herself. They were for the people who never got this kind of moment. The ones who didn't live to hear someone speak their truth aloud, who had passed on believing they'd been forgotten. They were for her town's dying Main Street, where the storefronts had been shuttered, but the pride still hung in every weathered American flag waving from rusted poles. They were for her parents, who had once struggled to pay for her school books, believing that maybe, just maybe, their daughter might live a little better, stand a little taller. With every word, it felt like a window had been opened, one she didn't know she needed. The air rushed in, fresh and familiar, reminding her of the values that had always lived inside her, but had been buried beneath cynicism and the noise of modern life. The emotion overtook her not because she was weak, but because she was human. Because sometimes when the truth finally finds you, it doesn't ask permission before it takes hold. The cameras may have caught her wiping her cheek, but they could never capture what was happening in her heart. She wasn't embarrassed. If anything, she felt humbled. It wasn't every day that someone said the things she'd longed to hear for years, things that dignified the lives of the working poor, the blue-collar backbone of the country, the forgotten middle that carried more than they should have and asked for less than they deserved. In that moment, everything felt still. The noise of politics, the divisions, the headlines, they all faded. All that remained was the weight of acknowledgement, the echo of long-silenced voices being brought into the light. And for her, that light was overwhelming. It illuminated everything she'd been taught to cherish: honor, resilience, faith, sacrifice, and wrapped it all in something she hadn't. The morning after the speech, the world looked the same, but she didn't. Something inside her had shifted. It was subtle at first, like the quiet click of a lock turning, but it echoed through her every thought. She moved through the motions of her day, answering emails, sipping coffee, glancing at headlines, but none of it felt routine anymore. She kept hearing those words in her head, the ones that stirred something far deeper than inspiration. It wasn't just about emotion, it was about direction. She had been waiting for a sign, perhaps without even realizing it. Now she had one. For years, she had lived with an ache she couldn't name. A frustration that bubbled up every time she watched working people dismissed as backward or clung to values others called outdated. It wasn't that she wanted attention or applause. She just wanted representation. And that night, hearing someone give voice to everything she believed in, everything she'd grown up with, it lit a fire that couldn't be put out. She could no longer be content to just agree quietly. She had to act. That day, she opened her laptop and began to write. Not a tweet or a post, but a plan. The kind of plan that came not from ambition, but conviction. She started making a list of the issues no one in her generation seemed willing to touch. Things like faith, family, community, personal responsibility. They weren't talking points to her. They were truths, lived truths, and they deserved to be defended. She thought of the teachers who taught her not only to read, but to think. Of her neighbors who shoveled each other's driveways without expecting anything in return. Of the local mechanic who kept cars running for families who couldn't afford new ones. These were the people whose stories had always mattered to her, even when the national conversation ignored them. She began reaching out, making phone calls, reading policies. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it felt right. There had been a time when she believed that only people with wealth, connections, or Ivy League degrees could shape the future. She had always admired those who tried, but deep down she questioned whether someone like her, young, female from a working-class family, could make a real difference. That doubt was gone now. What replaced it wasn't arrogance, but clarity. She didn't need to sound like anyone else. She needed to sound like herself. Because the truth was, millions of people had stories like hers. They just needed someone to say them out loud. She knew there would be pushback. She knew she'd be called names. She'd be underestimated, ridiculed, maybe even silenced. But she had already made peace with that. Because when you know who you are and who you stand for, the noise doesn't shake you, it steals you. Her journey wouldn't be about fame or approval. It would be about truth, about being a voice for people whose stories had been brushed aside in favor of sound bites and slogans. As the days turned into weeks, she dove headfirst into the world of public service. She interned where she could, volunteered on campaigns, studied the Constitution with the same intensity her friends studied for final exams. She wrote speeches at night, took meetings during lunch breaks, and never forgot why she started. Every moment that followed was anchored in that single night, that single spark of recognition, when she realized she didn't need permission to lead, only purpose. Her friends noticed the change. So did her mentors. She walked with more conviction, spoke with more weight. The girl who once sat quietly in the back now found herself standing at podiums, not out of ego, but out of duty. It was never about being the loudest, it was about being the clearest, and clarity, she learned, was power. She didn't wait for the perfect opportunity. She made one, because she believed the moment you recognize your calling is the moment you start answering it. And for her, that answer wasn't a dream, it was a decision. A decision to fight for the kind of country her grandfather believed in, to carry the values her parents lived every day, and to make sure that the next young woman sitting in a gallery seat, heart full of hope, would hear words that changed her life, too. She stood now in places she once only watched from afar. Podiums, interviews, town halls, rooms where decisions were made and futures were shaped. But she hadn't arrived there by accident, and certainly not by privilege. Her journey didn't begin with connections or fanfare. It began with emotion, with conviction, with a moment that cracked her heart open and let a new purpose pour in. She often thought back to that night when it all began, not because she wanted to relive the spotlight, but because it reminded her of who she was before the world started, calling her bold, articulate, unshakable. Before anyone cared what she had to say, she was just a young woman in a crowded room, holding back tears and holding on to a truth she could no longer ignore. That truth was her guide now. It walked beside her in every meeting, echoed in her voice during every debate, and steadied her when opposition tried to rattle her. It was never about ambition. It was about responsibility. Once she realized she had the power to speak for people who felt invisible, she couldn't turn away. The waitress with 2 jobs and no health insurance, the farmer drowning in regulations, the young couple trying to raise kids with dignity in a culture that mocks their values. These were not case studies to her. They were family, friends, neighbors, and now they were her mission. She didn't try to imitate anyone else. She didn't wear a mask or fit into a mold. She didn't change her accent or soften her stances to make others comfortable. Instead, she leaned into what made her different: her story, her grit, her willingness to walk into rooms where people underestimated her and leave those same rooms having earned their respect. Not everyone applauded her. In fact, many didn't. There were plenty who rolled their eyes, who labeled her too young, too naive, too outspoken, but she didn't need universal approval. She only needed truth on her side. And she had it. Because every time she opened her mouth, it wasn't for herself. It was for the grandmother who raised her to pray before every meal, for the mechanic who taught her the value of a hard day's work, for the teacher who stayed after hours to help kids pass a test no one thought they could. Her rise wasn't meteoric. It was methodical. Step by step, word by word, heart to heart. She listened more than she spoke in those early days, sitting with veterans at VFW halls, walking through shuttered downtowns, knocking on doors in towns most reporters ignored. She wasn't trying to sell a message. She was trying to live one. And that authenticity became her greatest strength. People didn't just hear her. They felt her. Because she wasn't repeating lines from a teleprompter. She was speaking from the same pain, the same pride, the same stubborn hope that so many others carried but didn't know how to express. She gave them language. She gave them courage. And most of all, she gave them representation. Now, as she addressed crowds of all sizes, from school auditoriums to national conventions, she carried that night in her voice. The emotion of it, the clarity of it, the transformation it sparked. It didn't just inspire her, it recalibrated her entire life, and that transformation became a symbol to others. Proof that you didn't have to be born into power to wield it. You didn't have to inherit influence to earn it. You just had to care enough to try. She often caught glimpses of herself in younger women, eyes wide, not with naivety, but with possibility. And she made it her mission to tell them the truth, that leadership doesn't begin with applause. It begins with a moment of stillness, a moment when your heart breaks open, when your purpose takes root. That's where the real work begins. Because everything she had become, the leader, the speaker, the voice, began with a single choice: to stop watching from the sidelines and start stepping into the light. Not for glory, but for service. Not for herself, but for the millions who deserved to see someone like them standing tall. And so, what began as a single moment of emotion, quietly blooming in the shadows of a grand chamber, transformed into a calling that could not be silenced. She hadn't set out to make history, to draw headlines, or to become a symbol. All she had done was listen to her heart, to her values, to the stories she carried from home. But in doing so, she ignited a spark that resonated far beyond her own life. People often think the world is changed by those with the loudest voices or the biggest titles. But sometimes, it's changed by someone who simply refuses to forget where they came from. She never let go of the front porches, the factory floors, the church pews, and the dirt roads that shaped her. She didn't run from them. She ran toward them, knowing that true strength is found not in separating yourself from everyday people, but in standing shoulder to shoulder with them. Her journey serves as a reminder that integrity still matters. That faith, in oneself, in others, in a greater purpose, can still move mountains. And that emotion, when channeled into action, becomes one of the most powerful forces in the world. She cried not out of weakness, but out of a fierce and steady belief that ordinary people deserve to be seen, heard, and uplifted. Now, wherever she goes, whether it's a small town diner or a crowded town hall, she carries that belief like a banner. She speaks with the authority of someone who's lived what she stands for. People don't follow her because she's perfect. They follow her because she's real, because she speaks from the scars, from the struggle, from the soil of a life rooted in authenticity. And as she continues to rise, she does so with humility. Because for her, it was never about personal elevation. It was always about lifting others. About lighting the path so the next person could walk it with a little less fear and a little more fire. In the end, the story wasn't just about a single speech or a single tear. It was about a choice to feel, to believe, and to act. That choice became her compass. And through it, she became something more than she ever imagined. She became a testament to what's possible when you allow your heart to break in the right direction, and then let that brokenness guide you toward purpose, passion, and profound